Galileo Galilei did not set out to challenge the world. He only wanted to look. At a time when truth was inherited rather than discovered, Galileo made a quiet but unforgivable mistake. He trusted his own eyes. The universe, according to authority, was already understood. The heavens were perfect. The earth was still. Everything had its place. And questioning that order was not curiosity, it was defiance. Galileo was not born into power. He did not speak with divine authority. He built his reputation slowly, through observation, calculation, and relentless doubt. And that was the problem. He did not accept truth because it was old. He accepted it only when it could survive scrutiny. When Galileo turned his telescope toward the sky, he did something far more dangerous than discovering new stars. He discovered imperfections, shadows on the moon, movement where there should have been none, a sky that was not eternal and flawless, but dynamic and unsettled. This was not just astronomy, it was heresy disguised as observation. He was warned early, not threatened, warned, because the system did not yet see him as an enemy. He was dismissed as eccentric, overly curious, obsessed with details that did not matter, a man who stared too long at the heavens and mistook illusion for insight. After all, how could one man's observations outweigh centuries of belief? Galileo understood what he was risking long before others did. He knew that facts do not exist in isolation. They exist inside power structures. To challenge the cosmos was to challenge those who claimed to speak for it. Still, he continued, not because he wanted conflict, but because, once seen, truth cannot be unseen. The more evidence he gathered, the quieter the room became. Conversations ended when he entered. Support turned cautious. Curiosity turned into suspicion. He was no longer just a scholar. He was becoming a problem. Galileo had not yet been silenced. He had not yet been judged. But the first, most dangerous shift had already occurred. People stopped arguing with him and started watching him. And when a society stops debating ideas and starts monitoring those who hold them, the outcome is rarely discovery. It is control. This was the moment Galileo's life divided in two, before he looked too closely, and after the world realized what he had seen. Galileo's observations did not remain his alone. Truth has a habit of escaping the rooms where it is discovered. What began as private notes and quiet sketches soon moved from desk to desk, from whisper to whisper. Copies were made, drawings circulated. The telescope, once a personal instrument, became an invitation. Others wanted to see, and when they did, the sky no longer belonged to authority. It belonged to anyone willing to look. Galileo's name began to travel faster than his caution. Scholars repeated his claims. Students defended them. Some praised his courage. Others questioned his sanity. But no one could ignore him anymore. Fame arrived not as celebration, but as exposure. Every new observer weakened the old certainty. Every confirmation turned doubt into fear. Because Galileo was no longer a solitary thinker, he was becoming a source. And sources are dangerous. The more people looked through telescopes, the more fragile the inherited universe appeared. The moon showed scars. The heavens moved. The earth no longer felt central or special. This was not a correction of detail. It was a rearrangement of meaning. Galileo understood what this meant long before his critics admitted it aloud. If the cosmos could be questioned, then so could the voices that claimed to explain it. He tried to soften his tone. He chose careful language. He framed observation as curiosity, not rebellion. But clarity is its own kind of defiance. As admiration grew, so did scrutiny. Invitations arrived from powerful places, not all of them friendly. Supporters spoke more quietly. Former allies hesitated. Galileo had crossed an invisible line. The danger was no longer in what he had seen. but in how many others now saw it too. And once truth becomes shared, it can no longer be quietly dismissed. It must be controlled. Galileo did not wake up one morning to find himself condemned. Condemnation does not begin with punishment. It begins with advice. At first, the messages were gentle, well-intentioned, even kind. Friends warned him to be careful with his words. Allies suggested he slow down, soften his conclusions, present his ideas as possibilities rather than truths. Not because he was wrong, but because he was too clear. Galileo listened. He understood the language being spoken beneath the politeness. This was not a debate about stars or planets. It was a negotiation about obedience. He was being offered a compromise. You may continue your work. You may keep your reputation. You may even keep your freedom. But only if you stop insisting that what you see is real. For a moment, Galileo hesitated. He was not reckless. He had lived long enough to know how power reacts when questioned. He had no desire to become a martyr. He wanted to observe, to teach, to think, not to fight institutions that had existed longer than his lifetime. So he adjusted his tone. He chose his words carefully. He framed certainty as discussion. But restraint did not calm the room. It only confirmed the fear. Because a truth that survives caution is more dangerous than one shouted recklessly. The warnings became firmer. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended quickly. Supporters began speaking in private, never in public. The silence around Galileo thickened, not with ignorance, but with calculation. He was being isolated, politely. Galileo realized then that the issue was no longer whether the earth moved or stood still. The issue was whether a man was allowed to trust his own eyes more than inherited authority, and that question could not be tolerated. From that moment on, everything Galileo said was interpreted not as curiosity, but as defiance, not as observation, but as intention. The telescope was no longer an instrument, it was evidence. Truth had crossed a line, and once truth becomes disobedient, it is no longer corrected. It is controlled. Galileo was not yet on trial. No charges had been spoken aloud, but the most important decision had already been made. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony, he would be allowed to live, but only if he stopped seeing. The summons did not arrive dramatically. There were no soldiers, no chains, no public accusation shouted into the streets. Just a request, polite, formal, unavoidable. Galileo understood immediately what it meant. Advice had failed. Silence had not been enough. Now, authority would speak without disguise. The room where he was questioned was not designed for debate. It was built for certainty. Stone walls, heavy tables, men who did not look up at the sky because they believed they already knew what it contained. Galileo was not asked what he had seen. He was asked what he meant. Every word was examined, not for accuracy, but for intention. Observation was reframed as persuasion, curiosity as influence, the telescope as provocation. He realized then that evidence was irrelevant. The outcome had already been imagined. The only remaining question was whether Galileo would cooperate with it. Fear entered the room quietly, not as violence, but as consequence. He was reminded of his age, of his fragile health, of the comfort of silence, and of the alternative. Galileo had spent his life trusting reason, but reason offers little protection when power no longer seeks to understand. This was not a trial of facts. It was a test of obedience. For the first time, Galileo considered retreat, not because he doubted what he had seen, but because he understood what was being demanded of him. To live, he would have to speak against his own eyes. The weight of that choice pressed harder than any threat. Silence, he realized, was no longer passive. It was being shaped into a requirement. And the most terrifying truth became clear. They did not need Galileo to be wrong. They only needed him to stop being right out loud. The moment did not come with drama. There was no shouting, no spectacle, no final argument, just a room, a statement, and a choice that was never truly a choice. Galileo stood where he was told to stand. The words placed before him were precise, carefully shaped by others. He was not asked to explain, he was asked to repeat. Each sentence erased something he had seen. Each line, rewritten, replaced observation with obedience. This was not a confession of error. It was a performance of submission. Galileo knew the difference. He knew that truth does not vanish when denied aloud, but he also knew that bodies break faster than ideas survive. Age had slowed him. Fear had narrowed the room. The weight of consequence pressed down harder than any argument ever had. So he spoke, not because he believed the words, but because silence had been redefined as survival. With every sentence, something inside him fractured. Not his certainty, but his identity. The man who trusted his own eyes was now required to betray them publicly. This was not the victory of authority. It was the demonstration of power. Galileo was allowed to live, but living came with conditions. His voice would no longer travel freely. His ideas would no longer move openly through classrooms and conversations. Truth would exist only in whispers and memory. Legend says that as he turned away, Galileo muttered a quiet defiance. And yet, it moves. Whether he said it or not no longer matters. What matters is this: the world learned that day that truth could be forced to kneel, but not to disappear. Galileo did not leave the world in chains. He left it quietly. Confined to his home, watched but rarely spoken to, he lived the rest of his life surrounded by the same sky he was no longer allowed to publicly describe. His punishment was not pain, but irrelevance, a slow fading from conversation, from classrooms, from influence. The house was small, the days were long, the silence was constant. His telescope no longer traveled, his words no longer spread. Visitors came rarely, and when they did, they spoke carefully, as if truth itself had become contagious. Galileo continued to think. Even as his body weakened, his mind did not surrender. Blindness crept in, first as irritation, then as permanence. The man who had trusted his eyes lost them, but not the certainty they had given him. He dictated his final works to others. Knowledge, once spoken freely, now passed through whispers and memory. The ideas slowed, but they did not stop. Outside his walls, the world moved forward without admitting it had ever been wrong. Authority remained intact. The sky remained officially still. And yet, quietly, students remembered. Scholars revisited old notes. Instruments improved. Observations accumulated. Long after Galileo's voice had been silenced, his vision began to speak again. Not through defiance, but through inevitability. He did not live to see vindication. There were no apologies, no formal reversals in his lifetime, only the slow, irreversible shift of understanding. Galileo died knowing that truth does not need permission, only time, and history would eventually confirm what power tried to suppress. You can force a man to kneel, you can force him to be silent, but you cannot force the universe to lie forever.